Oh, well, thank you, Julian, and thank all of you for being here and giving up a little bit of your afternoon to come and listen to me talking about poetry, a sort of ageing, portly old grandmother talking about poetry, what can be best for the post-lunchtime slot. OK, well, I'm going to be talking about the pleasures and the perils of poetry, and I'm sure some of you are thinking, what on earth can be perilous about poetry? I mean, what can it do to you that can possibly be so dangerous? What's the worst that can happen? Maybe a few ink stains, maybe some eye strain, maybe a crick in the neck from bending over your books, maybe even a paper cut. What can poetry possibly do that's worse than that? Well, while you're pondering on that, I'm going to be speaking, actually, for a few moments about what I think are the quiet pleasures of poetry. Let's just see if this... No, possibly. Yeah, there we go. OK, well, look, first of all, I love poetry. I'd like to say I'm passionate about poetry because passionate is one of those words that these days are used, you know, sort of interchangeably with words such as like. But you know what? Poetry doesn't make my heart race. It doesn't make my heart, you know, my breath catch in my chest or anything. Tell you the truth, these days there's not a great deal that does. And looking at this lot, you know, there's not going to be a great deal of passion for them either, even though I suppose that in their day they would make a little heart flutter underneath a bit of muslin at the time. But you know what? Reading poetry makes me feel relaxed, makes me feel thoughtful. It makes me feel engaged with tiny snippets and bits of time and space that perhaps I would never otherwise have known if it hadn't been for reading a particular poem. It gives me an odd sense of discovery from the safety, actually. You know, we're talking about perils, but from the safety of an armchair or a park bench or somewhere, this sense of discovery. When I write poetry, I feel a sense of creativity, achievement, the satisfaction of having found what I believe are exactly the right words to express a precise momentary thought. It can feel almost exhilarating without having to break into a sweat. Is this going to happen? Yes. OK. So, look, poetry, I know, is not universally popular. But interestingly, book sales of poetry books have gone up a great deal in the recent years. This is Rupi Kaur, or rather one of her poems from her book. Now, she is known as an Instagram poet. I think she's in her mid to late 20s. She's incredibly successful as a poet, and that's really quite unusual. And it's largely because of the internet and the way that she has been able to get her work out there. For many people, poetry is just no more than a collection of words that don't always readily release their meaning. But as an art form, it is definitely gaining in popularity, which, you know, makes me a very happy person. And I hope it will inspire you to touch into it and get into it a little bit. Poets can be found these days on the telly, not just reciting their work, but also sharing their thoughts on current issues. And that's, of course, because poets are thinkers. They're deep thinkers. And in this very complex day and age, we really do need powerful thinkers and good communicators. I love the fact that young people are starting to go out to bars and hold poetry slams, hold poetry evenings, open mic sessions. Poetry, as far as I can see, is coming back to its strength. And like I say, with Rupi Kaur, it's aided by the internet because poets can now give their work international exposure, which they couldn't in the past. Now, poetry, in its heyday, was the best means of communication. I mean, forget WhatsApp and Snapchat and all this stuff. In the good old days, before writing had really happened, except for, you know, a few monks sitting in scriptoria somewhere, we used to pass on our stories as communities and our tribes, and we used to remember our histories about what went on in the past and our identities by means of poems. Why? Well, because it's through creating rhythms and through creating rhymes in our speech that we actually remember things. We can remember information much more effectively, and therefore we can recount information more effectively. So poetry taps into the parts of your brain that helps us to remember things. Maybe not in its full complex details, but it helps us to carry the message and remember the essence of something. And poetry is intensely powerful. Words are powerful. Words can make or break a deal. They can start a war. They can start a love affair. They can end a friendship. Words can hurt and words can heal. Poetry reaches into us intimately. It gives us insight. It exposes ideas. It illuminates parts of the world and of humanity that we'd never thought of before. In ancient times, the power of words was recognised and highly respected. Bards and poets travelled the world recording what they saw. They recorded the wars won by heroes, the tragedy of defeats, the horrors of famine and pestilence, and they recorded it all in the words of poems. Think of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the great sagas of Norse mythology. In fact, words were considered so powerful that the ancient Celts would bring their bards with them to battle, so that they could use their words to curse the enemy, which was pretty effective because the Roman army, on occasion, fled in front of the sight of the Druids and the bards, and also to compose their poems about the glorious victories and the obvious occasional tragic defeats. Wandering minstrels would be famous in courts throughout the world, and a place was always found at somebody's hearth for a poet. Think of the troubadours of medieval southern France or the Viking skalds. And even powerful leaders today will fear the curse of the bard. Maybe they'll curse the bards as well. Like many of us, I suppose, my first encounter with poetry and the way that I could play with words in my mouth was when I was a kid. And this is part of the pleasure of poetry, playing about with words. It can be a game, it can be, believe it or not, it can be fun. Through nursery rhymes, children learn to speak. They learn to understand the rhythm of language. And from there, they learn to read. And then they learn to write. Rhyming is an intensely powerful way of learning to be literate. And if my generation, I mean, we loved talking, singing rhymes about climbing hills with Jack and Jill and old Mother Hubbard, rummaging about in empty cupboards, old women that lived in shoes. My grandkids absolutely adore the rhyming stories of Julia Donaldson. I don't know if any of you have encountered them. Room on the Broom being perhaps one of the current favourites, The Snail and the Whale. I mean, it's great. Playing with words is a great way for kids to learn. Poetry is meant to be spoken aloud. It's poetry that teaches us to speak, to write, and because just a few perfectly chosen words make up a poem is the perfect thing to describe a place, a person, or a feeling. It intensifies experience. So poetry challenges us, I think, and it makes us think. That's one of the great positives of poetry. It helps us to engage the part of our brain that does the what-if bit, the bit that imagines, that explores possibilities, that creates, innovates, and invents, which is why actually poetry is a great contributor to our communities. Now, many years ago, when I was at St Mary's Junior School in the Upper Town, I had a brilliant teacher who I've never seen since, and she was called Miss Gandeas, and she introduced me to Edward Lear. And my goodness, were they wonderful words. She read us all the nonsense poems, and she helped us to explore the meaning of words which actually didn't really exist. So it really sort of helped us think about what if? What if? It's a wonderful thing for everybody, for writers. What if? The Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. I mean, what's that all about? Okay? I mean, it's nonsense, but it's fabulous. And then as she read, the poetry came to life, and then after that we looked at the pobble that had no toes, up there in the top corner, the Owl and the Pussycat. I went to see all the wonderful limericks that Lear wrote, and you know what? By then I was hooked. I couldn't help it. It was brilliant. Now, poetry intensifies experiences, intensifies meaning. As I grew older, when I was at home, away from school, my mum used to recite the most wonderful adventure poems. And at 78, you know what? She can still do it, and it's amazing. So I was introduced to stories about highwaymen, about the Inchcape Rock, about young Lochin Var, about Sir Lancelot in The Lady of Shalott, and then eventually worked through lots of different poems, through to W.B. Yeats, who's one of my favourite poets, and this guy here, Seamus Heaney, whose words are just absolutely wonderful. These are words that created images in my mind and triggered feelings that no visual image has matched or can match, I don't think, even though I love binge-watching Netflix just like everybody else does. So one of the foremost pleasures, as far as I'm concerned, of poetry must be its ability to encapsulate some of the most important human events, some of the most important human experiences, intensified with selected words. And it's through the engaging of our emotions with these words that we're able to remember the poems and the messages that they try to communicate. Now, poetry can be healing. It's therapeutic. It's cleansing, both for the writer and the reader. The act, when you write a poem, of exploring your own feelings, your fears, bringing them to the fore, putting them down on paper, on a note on your phone or on a computer, it helps you face yourself and develop an understanding that perhaps you didn't have. You can release pain through poetry. The words provide like an outlet. They take the stopper off a bottle and let out the pressure. And when, as a writer, you explain something to a potential reader, you're also explaining it to yourself, so it helps you to understand things better. And as a reader, the experience of reading poetry opens up a window to your own feelings, makes you think, helps you to understand other views, other people. It helps develop self-awareness and empathy, and those are two vital ingredients of being human. Now, I could go on and on and on about the pleasures of poetry, but I've really got to get through the hazards. I can see the clock counting down. So, poetry can cause you pain. Now, we've talked about the power of words. They can inflict emotional pain. They set off a chain of harm. Now, Catullus's invectives were during the Roman times were just as vicious as the trolls are in Twitter times. I'm not going to quote any because I'd be thrown off stage by Julian for being obscene. But they were really nasty things. Ancient kings would quake at the thought of having themselves written or being the subject of a poetic nasty. So be warned, don't wind up your local poet. Okay, poetry can also wreck your posture. Okay, we can laugh at that, but actually, do you know what? You can get backache. And it's certainly, sitting around reading and writing is not going to do much for your waistline. So if you're a poet, you need to get moving, and even if it's only as far as the library now and again, okay? Just get out there. Poetry can be difficult. Sometimes it can feel like a wall that you can't get through, that you can't climb up. And that's how I used to feel about some of the old poets, like Gerard Manley Hopkins. And if Giordano is here, I know you love him, but I still can't get on with Gerard Manley Hopkins, okay? Nevertheless, once you get through that, once you can scale that wall, some poems are absolutely exhilarating. And when you leave here, please look up The Cloth of Heaven by W.B. Yeats, and you will see exactly what I mean. Poetry can change the world. That's a scene from the Peterloo riots in Manchester in 1822, and it inspired a very famous poem by Shelley called The Mask of Anarchy. Poetry can and has fueled revolutions. It can be highly political. Nowadays, you've got George the Poet performing protest poetry to hundreds of thousands of people on YouTube. Ideas can communicate worldwide through poetry. And it can cause turbulence because people don't like things to change. They don't like things to be different. Poets are often amongst the foremost intellectuals that are censored by governments. So, it can land you in jail. All right? Freedom of speech has not always been as valued as it is now, and in some places it still isn't. In the 1960s in the USA, the poet Allen Ginsberg was imprisoned because of his anti-nuclear and anti-war sentiments and activism, which were encapsulated in a lot of his poetry. In the UK in the 30s and 40s, an Irish poet, Brendan Behan, considered one of the foremost writers in Ireland at the time, was imprisoned because of his links to the IRA. And in 1692, Daniel Defoe was arrested for being in debt and put into prison, which happened quite frequently to poets, being in prison and being in debt, which leads me to the fact that actually, you know what, poetry can make you poor. Because if you've got to rely on your poetry for an income, then you've got to be prepared for a bit of poverty. It just doesn't pay. It doesn't pay the rent, doesn't pay for a loaf of bread. So most poets are likely to get a few quid just for a poem. Many will self-publish their work and they will never break even. Of course, it shouldn't be a prerequisite of writing good poetry to be poor, but it is rare that anybody can make a decent living just out of being a poet these days. And of course, poetry can kill. One of the worst hazards. It is pretty extreme, but look, it hasn't, and it does happen. In the days of the Spanish Civil War, just up the road in Granada, Federico García Lorca, arguably one of Spain's best poets, was shot. This young man here on the corner, Hasham Shabani, he was executed in Iran in 2014 because of his poetry and because of other reasons, but obviously he was expressing it in his poetry. In the Soviet Union in 1952, 5 Jewish poets were executed. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Yet it is because of their courage, their refusal to stay silent, their insistence of writing words, the meaning of which uttered some universal truths that threatened the powers around them. They got killed, but we inherited those words and we learnt an awful lot. Poetry has the power to move and to inspire in a way that other word forms simply don't. So, the bips are going. I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to leave you with the thought that perhaps, there are perils to poetry, even though you didn't think there were, that hopefully the pleasures outweigh those perils. Thank you for listening, and get those pens out and write some good poetry. Thank you.